14 college football committee rankings were released last night. And, in a couple ways, the rankings are the rankings. I mean, if you look at the top five, you really shouldn't be too surprised. Ohio State, Indiana, Texas A&M, Georgia, and Texas Tech. And then as you move down the list, that's where it gets kind of dicey, right? Because you have Notre Dame at number 9, Alabama at 10, BYU at 11, Miami at 12, and Utah at 13. As it stands right now, because of the ACC champion, who today would be Virginia, even though ESPN tries to convince everybody that it's Miami for whatever reason, and the G5 champion who gets in, presumably Tulane or James Madison at this point in time, it begs the question of, or really the biggest debate that I think all of us have had when we looked at these rankings is, why is Miami not ranked above Notre Dame? And there's a couple factors that you can kind of put in. I'd say first and foremost, I mean, I would say many times the committee has been kind of hypocritical and contradicting in terms of how they are doing their rankings. And it's fascinating because you see Reese Davis, you see Kirk Herbstreit and Desmond Howard interview the committee. And it's interesting because they said time and time again, hey, head-to-head is going to matter more. Playing a tougher schedule is going to matter more. Winning the games that you're supposed to actually win are going to matter more. And that doesn't really seem very indicative when you kind of look at these rankings, because I'll be the first one to tell you on a personal note, I find Notre Dame just as annoying as everybody else does, because you get all the benefits of being an independent without any of the consequences or the standard that they should be held to. But nevertheless, the simple reality of it for everybody should be that Miami beat Notre Dame head-to-head. Therefore, they're above them. It's really that simple, especially when you have the same record and the fact that Miami plays a conference schedule. And the fact that you play a conference schedule, I'm always going to be a little bit more favoring that team, because when you're Notre Dame and you have all the luxuries of your own television deal, you have your own seat at the table at the committee, in the committee room, and you get the benefit of being an independent, scheduling your own schedule every year. To me, unless they win 10 games and are essentially flawless 10, 11 games every year, then they don't deserve to be in the college football playoff. Because as it stands right now, they quite frankly don't really deserve to be in. Because as I see it right now, I would argue that Miami, Alabama, and I'll even throw BYU in there, all three of them deserve to be in over Notre Dame. And a lot of people like to dismiss BYU. I don't really understand why, because yes, they got spanked versus Texas Tech, but if you look at the rest of their resume, they've taken care of business when they've had to. They beat some really tough opponents. They beat Utah. They beat Arizona State. They beat West Virginia. They've beaten a good amount of their Big 12 slate, and they took care of their non-conference schedule. So when you kind of look at that, and then you kind of look at what Notre Dame's accomplished, I mean, Notre Dame is beating the teams that they're supposed to beat. And yes, the one thing I will say about Notre Dame, right, is we shouldn't necessarily dismiss that, they only lost to Texas A&M by 3, and they barely lost to Miami. So both those games are relatively close, right? So that's why I'm not going to sit there and say, oh, Notre Dame's a bad team or they don't deserve to be there. I'm not saying that at all, because I've, in fact, have been on the record on this show saying that I think CJ Carr, for a freshman quarterback, has been playing with phenomenal poise. He has been a really solid decision maker. He has a good arm, and he's finding the receivers that are open, and most importantly, he's being a leader. And then when you have Jeremiah Love and Price and that 1-2 punch, who have been so much fun to watch this year, I had Jeremiah Love as my number 2 in terms of the Heisman Trophy race, and they still have Stanford on the schedule this week. So for all intents and purposes, they will end up being 10-2 this year. And all of that's great at the end of the day. And also, they deserve a ton of credit for being in the national championship game last year. All of that is very much true. But the reality is, in this day and age, somebody's going to get left out. You know what I mean? At this point in time, BYU would get left out. And at this point in time, I just don't see a scenario where you could argue that they shouldn't get in. Because even when you look at it right now, let's say Alabama is the last team to get in. They have to play the Iron Bowl this week versus an Auburn team who I think are going to show some fight. They're going to show some determination, especially too when from the reports that I've heard that DJ Durkin is going to be seriously considered for the long-term coaching position. And I would say rightfully so. I think he has done a lot more at Maryland than people think. I think after the kind of the bullying, I'll call it a bullying scandal, so to speak. After that, he's kind of worked his way up as a defensive coordinator, and I would say it's about time that he's seriously considered for another chance as a head coach. Because if you're Auburn at this point, if you strike out on John Summerall, which we've all presumably have happened, like what direction that you go in? Because at this point, it's the toughest job in the country. But nevertheless, when otherwise, when I look at these rankings, Texas being a 3-loss team, being ranked that high, I'm not a huge fan of. The fact that USC lost to Oregon, I like that. I am indifferent about that spot. I think Virginia deserves a little bit more love too. But shout out to Vanderbilt too. I mean, Vanderbilt has had really a great year, all things considered, for a team that pretty much they were able to retain a lot of the guys that they had last year. They were able to bring in a couple of different key transfers to kind of help Diego Pavia and that offensive line in particular. You have a defense that has done a better job than people expected in terms of getting to the quarterback, so they deserve a lot of recognition. However, I still think it's ridiculous that Diego Pavia is now trying to sue the NCAA to try to get a 7th year of eligibility. If I were him, I would just be walk off of the sunset and be happy that you even got an extra year. But regardless, when I look at the schedule, when I look at these rankings, I'd say for the most part, the big conversation I think after this season, hopefully, is that they keep the 12-team playoff the way it is. I think the rankings that they have need to be fixed, but at the same time, too, I guess the conversation maybe perhaps should be, well, maybe there does need to be a computer model, kind of like the BCS. I'm not saying it has to be exactly like the BCS, but for those of you who don't know how that's calculated, it's pretty much indicative of not only votes from journalists, but also various metrics from a bunch of different sources that are all kind of compiled together to give you a score. And that score is essentially ranking you from 1 to 25 in this case. So maybe there does need to be an analytical aspect to college football again. And don't get me wrong, I thought Mack Rhodes was great as the committee chair. I think it makes a lot of sense in terms of how well respected he is, how many different stops that he had before, even though he had to step down. We think it's because of the scene that he had with the Baylor tight end. Now Hunter Yurachek comes in, who's the athletic director of Arkansas, and I have to tell you, I am feel pretty indifferent about him being the committee chair, at least in the interim. He's just not the most exciting person, not necessarily the greatest spokesperson for college football, because when I watched the committee show over again, they really just couldn't give you a very straight answer as to why Notre Dame once again is ranked above Miami and Alabama and BYU. Because I'll say it on this show, I don't care how many Notre Dame fans it pisses off. They have no business being number 9. They are not the number 9 team in the country. They have not played like the number 9 team in the country. And I think it would really send the wrong message once again if a team like Notre Dame gets in. Because to me, essentially, you send the message of head-to-head doesn't really matter, number one. And most importantly, the other message I'd send is that you really only play an 8-game season. Because the arguments that I've heard online now is, oh, well, since Alabama lost to Florida State at the beginning of the year, it doesn't really matter as much because we know what the Florida State team is now, which I think that's just an asinine argument. Because if you use that logic, then why don't we just play a 9-game season and forget the other 3 games that happen? I've always been of the objective mind that you need to look at the schedule for what it is, how it is, because quite frankly, these schedules are scheduled years and years and years in advance. So there's only so much tinkering that you can do at any given time. Obviously, with the SEC going to 9 games, you're going to have to do that at least to some degree, right? And I'm not criticizing that. But what I am pointing out is we need to look at teams' full body of work, and we need to conceptualize and contextualize how these decisions are kind of coming together. Because, yes, I understand that the Notre Dame losses in hindsight don't look as bad because Texas A&M is undefeated and Miami's where they are and they lost to Syracuse, et cetera, et cetera. But it's just like you just get to a point where you can only make so many of those different justifications like that, because otherwise I think the committee did a pretty solid job at kind of compiling this all together. I just think with how consistently the Big 12 has been ranked, at least having 1 to 4 teams ranked, or even 5 teams ranked at some points into the season, I just think it would be a big travesty if you get in Notre Dame over Miami, BYU, and Alabama, who quite frankly I think have proven that they're more deserving.